Hi, yes, so I'm Seth Cooper from Northeastern University. Thanks for inviting me and thanks for coming to my talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about scientific discovery games and some work we've been doing to try to use data to improve scientific discovery games. So we heard a little bit about this in one of the previous talks, but a lot of my work looks at basically trying to use games for crowdsourcing citizen science, scientific discovery, human computation, basically building games where the mechanics and the rules of the game are based on some kind of real world problem so that we can try to put the time that players use playing the games towards solving these real world problems. And usually these are real world problems that are computationally difficult in some way, so we can't just solve them automatically, right? And that way it's useful to have human problem solving creativity and input into how we might solve these problems and try to combine essentially human brain power and computational brain power to solve otherwise unsolvable problems. And one of the games that I've been working on a lot in this domain is called Foldit, which is a multiplayer online game where the players are essentially competing and collaborating to try to find well-folded protein structures. And in the process, they may contribute something to help scientists understand about molecular protein structures that exist in the real world, or actually help them design new synthetic ones. And the players, this is a gameplay, the players are basically manipulating protein structures, trying to find compact shapes that they can fit into and get a high score, right? And there's some manual moves players can make, and there's automated moves that they have access to as well. It's been out since 2008, and we've had well over 500,000 players make accounts and play the game. They've contributed to a number of interesting scientific discoveries as well as scientific publications based on discoveries that have been made in the game. One of the sort of early ones was that they were able to correctly predict the structure of the Mason-Pfizer monkey virus retroviral protease, which is a protein that plays a role in the virus that leads to AIDS in rhesus monkeys. The experimental collaborators who we were working with had spent over a decade trying to solve the structure, and the players were able to solve it in less than 3 weeks. So that was very exciting. The players were able to develop structure prediction algorithms in the game to help automate their processes by writing code, and they came across some independent discoveries of similar algorithmic techniques as the biochemists were collaborating with. They've also worked with biochemists to redesign an existing enzyme that was tested, synthesized in the wet lab, and turned out to be about 17 times more effective than the enzyme that they started with. And recently, we were able to put experimental electron density into the game, and the players were actually able to produce higher quality structures, better fitting that experimental data than even the trained crystallographers who we were comparing to. And so in all of these sort of scientific discoveries that players make, we include either folded players or the name of the Foldit team that was contributing to this scientific discovery, right? So we give them credit right alongside the authors of the scientific papers that we write. And in fact, 2 of these papers now have actually contributed to protein structures that are available in the protein data bank, which have sort of crediting to the Foldit players there, which I think is very exciting because you can go and look in this database of protein structures and find some that have actually been contributed to by gamers. So we're working on a lot of new interesting kinds of directions with Foldit, including design of proteins completely from scratch. We're looking at design of drugs and other small molecules in the game, as well as perhaps interesting new ways to interact with the proteins using multi-touch and different kinds of devices like tablets and phones and so on. And our general approach has been to take a very iterative process to the design of the game based on data that we get back from the players playing. So we work very closely with biochemists and other scientists to take some sort of problem of interest that they're interested in, a protein structure or similar, and turn that into something that the game can understand and cast it essentially as a puzzle for the players to try to contribute to solving. And then we get a whole bunch of data back, telemetry data basically from players playing the game, which includes things like the structures that they're finding as they fold the protein, as well as a lot of data on gameplay, how long they play, what kinds of things they're doing, where they get stuck, when they quit playing, and so on. And we can take this information and kind of repeat and try to refine the design of the game and the way that we frame the puzzles for the players and so on, and try to kind of make everything better and better over time based on what we can see the players are doing. And so in this way, I really feel like it's sort of a collaboration between us and the players working together to try to make everything better and make some kind of scientific discovery. And in fact, one of the projects that we're working on now is something that we call Foldit Pipeline, which will hopefully make it easier for us to work with collaborators and the Foldit team and the Foldit players to take other work with other collaborators to take biochemistry problems and proteomics problems that they're interested in and put those into the game and work with players to help solve them. Or perhaps work with educators to use the game in their classroom on structures that are relevant to what they're trying to teach their students. So if there are any biochemistry researchers or educators in the audience, or if you know any, I would certainly be interested in talking to you at some point about how you might be interested in this if you are. However, despite all of this data that we can get from people playing the game, games derived from real-world problems have a number of kind of interesting and potentially unique challenges to actually making them interesting, engaging, and coming up with levels that players like to play. For example, the problems are predetermined, right? They're coming from some existing problem in the real world, and because of that, we can't arbitrarily change them. They still have to maintain whatever property is that's making it relevant to some kind of real-world problem. And in fact, the problems that we're trying to give to the players in the levels are generally of unknown difficulty, or we don't even know if it's possible to solve them, right? So unknown difficulty, unknown possibility, right? And because of this, it could possibly have some negative impact on player engagement and enjoyment because we as designers don't have all the freedom that we could possibly want to try to make the game more enjoyable in that respect. But one thing that we still can control, right, is the order in which players are given these kinds of problems. So for any given player, if they come into the game, we can decide what problem or what level they're going to get next. So this is kind of like in one of the earlier talks this morning, a little bit like the adaptivity of progression, right? When a player finishes one level, we get to decide which level they're going to see next, even though we don't necessarily have a lot of control over the properties of each individual levels. And so one of the things that I've been looking at recently, sort of a proof of concept, is considering this kind of like a matchmaking problem between players and levels and trying to draw on existing matchmaking systems that already exist. So for example, ELO, which is often used in chess, and Halo, TrueSkill, which is used, for example, in Halo to do matchmaking between players, right? So if you've ever heard, there's this chess grandmaster, and they have a rating of 2,400, right? That number is usually will be their ELO rating, and so a higher number usually means a stronger player, right? So the basic idea is everyone gets a rating number, and then you can maybe other parameters, and you can try to compare these amongst players to find a good match to make an interesting match between players. But similar to levels in a human computation game, you don't really know a whole lot about players beforehand. How good are they? Which players are going to come and play, and so on, right? So one thing that we've been exploring is what if we essentially just applied player versus player matchmaking to player versus level matchmaking and treat the levels as though they were just players in the game. And when a player attempts a level, treat that as though it were a match between two players and just run everything through the rating system. Then possibly we could use this matchmaking system based on the ratings of the players in the levels to try to provide players with an interesting order of levels to play through when they come into the game. And so as a test case, we've applied this in a game called Paradox, which is another human computation game originally developed for software verification, but the underlying problem is a max sat constraint satisfaction problem that the players try to solve by selecting variables constraints and scheduling various optimizations, but it's essentially a little puzzle that they try to solve to satisfy as many constraints as they can. They're given a target score to try to reach in order to successfully complete the level. And to look at this, we ran a two-phase experiment where first we gathered a bunch of data on players playing the levels to generate level ratings based on the rating system. And then we compared different level ordering strategies or different ways of adapting the progression essentially to players as they played the game. And we used the Glyco2 player rating system, which is similar in a lot of ways to ELO, but has a few more parameters in the model. And we recruited players off of Mechanical Turk for the purpose of this, just to get players very rapidly. And so in the first phase, essentially what we did was we took all the incoming players and a pool of levels that we had for Paradox, and we just kind of randomly assigned players to play particular levels and recorded whether they were successful or not. And then afterwards, we essentially just played back all that data into the rating system offline in kind of a post-processing pass to generate what the actual ratings for the levels were. So we kind of played back pretending as though we were using the rating system and got rating numbers for all of the levels in our sort of pool of levels that we were looking at. And then in the second phase, we compared different level ordering strategies that we could use. So in this case, we again had a bunch of incoming players come and play the game, and we randomly assigned them to different strategies that we might use to decide what level to give them next whenever they need a new level. And so the first one we did was based on matchmaking, where essentially we tried to assign players a new level to play based on their skill and their skill rating as they played and were successful or not, and the ratings that we had for levels. And so this is just an example trajectory of one player. As they move through, you can see the little dots are the ratings of the levels that were assigned to them, and the line is the rating of the player, and they're successful in sort of the first 4, and their rating goes up, and they're given harder and harder levels, or higher and higher rated levels. Then they're unsuccessful, their rating drops, and they're given easier levels, and so on, and then they progress. And in this way, the skill of the levels that is assigned to the players, or the rating of the level that's assigned to the players, is sort of adaptive and individual to each player. If they're successful, they get higher rated levels. If they're unsuccessful, they get lower rated levels. And then we compared to 2 relatively simple baselines, one being just giving the player the levels in increasing order of rating. So then this was the same for all players who got this order, just starting at the easiest one, the next easiest one, the next easiest one, and so on. And then we also compared to completely random order. So also different for every player, but not related to their skill at all, just giving them completely random levels. And so you can see, in this case, this player was given a very hard level as their second level, which they were not able to complete, right? And so what we found, among other things, at a very high level was essentially that players completed more levels when they were given levels in increasing or matchmaking order. So giving them in random order, players actually completed the fewest number of levels. And players were able to complete harder levels when they were given them in random or matchmaking order. And so when we gave players levels just in increasing order of rating, right, they sort of stuck in these very easy levels, and they never really get to anything challenging. And so from kind of a human computation or crowdsourcing or scientific discovery kind of game point of view, right, this is interesting because the players with the matchmaking order, right, they're completing more tasks, and they're also able to get to and complete more difficult tasks, right? So in this way, based on this sort of simple proof of concept experiment, it appears the sort of matchmaking order has this best of both worlds property where the players were able to complete a larger amount and difficulty of levels. So this might be an interesting kind of approach to using data from players playing the game to look at refining the game based on data that you get to solve real-world problems. An interesting thing is that in this case, right, the game's designer didn't even have to look at any of the levels to get a sort of a progression for the players through them and adapt to them. And it might also be useful for player-level matchmaking in other kinds of games that have similar constraint as scientific discovery games, for example, where you have procedurally generated content or user-generated content where the game's designer might not have complete control or oversight of all the content that players are going to see. And there's if you're interested in more details, we have a paper coming out at Foundations of Digital Games in a couple of weeks with a lot more details on kind of the design and the experiment. So of course I want to thank all the people who worked on this, as well as our supporters, the Foldit development team and players, and everyone else. So thanks. Here's my contact information. If you're interested in Foldit Pipeline, I'm also currently looking for a postdoc who's interested in crowdsourcing and games. So if you are interested, feel free to contact me as well, or anything else. There's my contact information. Thank you.